I do think we can build things into meetings and agendas and processes that not only allow space for curiosity and discussion, but actively try to foster it.
One of the most important contributions of a pre-mortem is to help create a culture of candor in a team where people aren't afraid to say things that might be unpopular.
What I also try to do in organizations is to normalize it, to talk about things going wrong, because things do go wrong, and that's fine. It's realistic. I love the word realism at work. Things go wrong, we look at it, we learn from it.
If you just assume that you're in a meeting and the point of the meeting is to come up with the best solution and then deploy it, that is a different mentality from saying, we don't fully know, and we know that details matter, so we're going to try a few different things and test them. That requires some openness to the idea that you don't know.
The bottom line here is what really matters. It's not the data that matters, it's the narrative that matters. As a leader, it actually doesn't matter so much what you think went wrong and went right. What matters is the story that your people are telling themselves tomorrow about the team, themselves, and you.
This is Banknotes, Banking Culture Reform. The views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System.
Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of the Banking Culture Podcast, part of the New York Fed's initiative to drive awareness and change in financial services culture. This season, we'll speak with experts on how organizations can build curiosity and learning mindsets into their cultures. We'll explore tools that are immediately useful in the information that they uncover, but at a deeper level, their repeated use can create a culture that treats mistakes as opportunities for improvement versus moments that instill fear. My name is Tony DiCario, and I'm with the New York Fed's culture team. So I'm here today in New York with Michael Hallsworth, and we are joined by phone by Scott Young. Both are with Behavioral Insights Team Americas. And I'd ask each of you to briefly introduce yourself. Michael, maybe you can start.
Sure. My name is Michael Hallsworth. I'm the Managing Director for the Americas for the Behavioral Insights Team.
And I'm Scott Young. I also work with Michael at the Behavioral Insights Team, and I lead our engagement with private sector clients.
Thank you. And again, welcome. So maybe we could start off, Michael, you can just describe to us what, for those who don't know, the Behavioral Insights Team is, what you all do.
Sure. We're an organization that takes findings from behavioral science, evidence about how people actually behave in the real world, and apply it to real world problems. We're practical. We develop kind of interventions to say, could you do something differently in your organization? And then generally speaking, we try and test it wherever possible rather than assuming it works. We've been around for about 15 years, and we had this kind of interesting history because originally we were created inside the UK government back in 2010, and people called us the Nudge Unit in relation to the book Nudge that came out then. And we still do the kind of same thing, but now around the world and with a range of different organizations.
Thank you. And Michael, I'm going to stay with you for a minute because you've recently responded to some of the current challenges in behavioral science by publishing a manifesto for the industry. Can you describe briefly kind of what you're hoping to achieve with the manifesto?
Sure. So I've been in the US 5 years now, and I hadn't realized still that the word manifesto has kind of weird connotations here. Where I'm from, it's just like a program of what you set out to do in the future. But putting that to one side, what we tried to do here was say, as I just mentioned, this kind of current wave of applying behavioral science has been around for 10 to 15 years. And to be fair, it's attracted a lot of attention. Organizations all around the world have invested in it. They've created behavioral science teams. We're talking about some big corporate players. We're talking about Google, for example. We're talking about Walmart. We're talking also about governments, the United Nations, World Bank, whole range of different institutions. And that's great, and a lot has been achieved. But I think also people looking at this development, this success would say, could we have done more? Are there missed opportunities? Arguably, a lot of what's been done has been looking at changing details, the way in which something is done, and saying, oh, it had this much effect, which is great. We need those kind of improvements. But I think behavioral science can do more. It can also look at bigger questions about how we set up our organizations, how we set up our regulatory systems, all those kind of things. with the manifesto, I try to take kind of criticisms that have come along with the success and say, here are 10 proposals for how we could do more with behavioral science in the future. These are the exciting things that can make a difference in the future. And then try to make them real, try to say what you'd actually need to do.
One of the things that you talk about is applying a behavioral lens. What's the difference between a lens and a behavioral science tool?
Yeah, sure. So where this is coming from is quite often in the past, people have approached behavioral science like it is a tool you can pick up and fix a problem, and indeed a particular kind of problem. Oh, this is a behavioral problem. Get the behavioral insights people and get the behavioral science tool, and we'll fix things in this particular area. And yeah, there are things you can do with that tool, but it also, behavioral science can be a lens through which you see all kinds of problems, right? It's a way of understanding the nature of the problem. I think that has some practical consequences because it means you're not just going around doing changes all the time. You may say, well, actually, we don't need to change anything, or we're trying to sustain a behavior. We're trying to, understand the problem in more depth, step back and say, what's our strategy? What's our approach here? Rather than let's go and nudge someone with a particular kind of tool. And so I'm just trying to make that point. It's about that deeper reassessment, I would say.
So one might argue that it requires a certain amount of curiosity, which is handy because that is our theme this season on the podcast. And so we're thinking through kind of how do you build cultures of learning and curiosity. But maybe before we get there, we should take a step back and think about why we would even want to build cultures of learning and curiosity. Scott, I might go to you first with this question.
Sure. Well, I think perhaps the most obvious answer or reaction to why we would want to promote learning and curiosity-based cultures, is that they're associated with continual growth and improvement. They're cultures that are consistently improving and not remaining stagnant. But I think another important aspect of it is that these kinds of cultures are also pretty closely associated with environments where people are also willing and able to admit mistakes and recognize them, as opposed to feeling compelled to cover them up or hide. And one term that we use in behavioral science that some may be familiar with is the idea of psychological safety in the workplace. The idea that folks are comfortable that they won't be punished or they won't be humiliated for either speaking up or, again, admitting when something isn't right. And when we think about conduct, I think there's a pretty close connection there because, in so many cases, people don't have negative intent, but perhaps they do something goes wrong or they do something wrong somewhat inadvertently. And then the question becomes, is that something that they can admit to and speak up and learn from, or does it potentially become something that they, again, feel a need to cover up? And then perhaps we have a snowball effect, which leads to worse behavior. So I think those two ideas are pretty correlated, and a learning culture can certainly help us in preventing small negative behaviors from growing and becoming much bigger issues.
And why do you think it is that most organizational cultures aren't naturally this way, aren't naturally kind of curiosity and learning based?
Well, I think some of it is certainly inherent or rooted somewhat in human nature. There are certainly issues of insecurity and some fear that all of us have as humans. But with that said, I think there's a lot of positive intent out there. I think most leaders, most people would like to have environments of this nature, but unfortunately, they often may default into more familiar patterns of behavior, the way things have been done previously, because again, that's often the easier path. And really what I'm getting at is that, to create these kinds of environments and foster them and nurse them really requires some real thought and work. Thinking about how everything from the mundane of how meetings are run, and, where and when and how people are speaking, to, most importantly, perhaps when we have challenges and problems, how they're discussed, how they're handled, and so forth. And are we reinforcing fears people may have, or are we doing perhaps the harder work of creating some of that safety that may contribute to a more positive environment?
So I guess the natural next question then is, what can behavioral science tell us about how to overcome or mitigate some of these dynamics? And Michael, I'll start with you.
Yeah, sure. So I think one thing to remember from behavioral science is that context matters and that people respond to what we call cues in their environment. So this is how habits are built up. You repeatedly kind of encounter something and you develop a kind of automatic response. So the first thing is that telling people what they should do is never enough, or rarely enough. What you've got to look at is, what are the repeated things that people see and feel in their organization that will shape their behavior. And so you need to look at processes. And some of these things can be quite mundane, but I know there has been work done, for example, about the ordering in which people speak at Federal Reserve minutes, for example. This can massively influence the course of a conversation. Mm-hmm. These apparently small things in terms of the ordering can lead conversations one way or another way, mm-hmm. can lead to these kind of self-reinforcing patterns and agreement, which lead to a different decision. And so you can look at things like, how do we set up meetings, like Scott mentioned, to try to ensure that there aren't these self-reinforcing patterns of everyone agreeing with the person who speaks first, or just being more mindful actually of that as a factor. Mm-hmm. I think there are various other things, like, for example, when you're hiring, how do you compare between candidates? We know that looking at candidates on their own can be less effective in terms of comparing between people with similar experiences, and can actually lead to greater bias and potentially discrimination. So the ways you can do it by comparing different parts of people's resume or experience together. So then, without seeing who has the most experience, you can say, this candidate seems better in this way, and you build up the kind of judgment bit by bit, comparing each facet with each facet. That means that you get a better result when you hire someone. Another thing might be around how do you buy stuff for your organization? These may sound like mundane things, but they're really important. Do you get the best deal for your organization when you're procuring things? There are simple things you can do to get a better deal by making comparisons and prompts at the moments of purchase. Make it easier to get a better deal. So I'm not saying you have to stand up as a leader and motivate everyone and give an inspiring speech. Yeah, that may be part of your job. You need to look at the prompts in people's everyday environments in organizations and rethink those. How do people make budgets? How do people hire? And if you can change those, you may start to get the smaller changes that lead to bigger cultural changes.
Are there prompts that kind of help people exercise their curiosity muscle, their willingness to gather other perspectives, to wonder about other perspectives?
Well, one very obvious one is time pressure and resource constraints. If you're goal directed and you have a particular thing to do, there's not much space for curiosity there. The other thing is licensing by leaders. So again, if your whole setup of a meeting is, let's get this done, mm-hmm. efficiency, mm-hmm. And you've minuted everything and memoed everything, mm-hmm. and put everything in the agenda, that doesn't leave any room for curiosity. Because curiosity, as I understand it to a large extent, involves non-goal directed behavior to a large extent. Your brain not focusing on something, but instead opening up to connections. Mm-hmm. And that kind of associative mode of thinking is really different from a kind of fully agendaed meeting. If you don't make space for that, it's not going to happen.
So what kinds of things should you do to make space for that, when the reality is the people who are listening to this podcast are working in financial services firms, they have goals, they need to meet those goals. They have time constraints. What are some thoughts that you have on kind of how to create that sort of space so that people can develop a habit of getting into a different mindset sometimes as they think about making decisions?
I do think we can build things into meetings and agendas and processes that, not only allow space for curiosity and discussion, but actively try to foster it. So, whether it's certain prompts or time allocation and so forth, but, again, building into the way we have our meetings or we go through our design briefs or whatever, the issue may be, that, specifically indicating that this is what we're looking for and, promoting and actively fostering, rather than the idea is to get through this agenda as quickly as possible, which is, again, obviously understandable and can be a default unless we consciously think otherwise.
Mm-hmm. And kind of normalize that process. Yeah, Michael?
I mean, one thing we do as an organization is test stuff, experiment, prototype. If you just assume that you're in a meeting and the point of the meeting is to come up with the best solution and then deploy it, that is a different mentality from saying, we don't fully know and we know that the details matter. So we're going to try a few different things and test them. And that requires some openness to the idea that you don't know, because you may feel like, as I know, a professional, you're paid to know the answer rather than trying to find it out through tweaking things or experimenting. And if you make a bigger point here, I think that mentality is quite often how we make policy as well. We tend to sort of consider all the options in a list and then say, this is the best one, we're going to deploy it. But actually, when things get into the real world, there are unexpected events, there are details that you haven't fully thought through that require some thought. So that certainty, that sort of lack of curiosity about how is this actually going to play out and contact the real world is potentially damaging.
Mm-hmm.
So we use experimentation, we use prototyping, try and get to some of that curiosity.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we're also speaking with Gary Klein, who pioneered naturalistic decision-making, which is exactly that. The real world is different from what's happening in a simulation, and therefore you need to think about how people really behave in real life.
Yeah, the real world is different from our expectations of it. We're often over-optimistic. You just look at major projects that always go over budget. We've done quite a bit of work on reducing overconfidence in government, because a lot of the incentives are to think the happy thoughts, to reinforce that this is a great idea, boss. Of course, it's going to work. And there are things you can do to say, well, actually, for example, if you're, a lot of the examples from infrastructure, you're running the Olympics, right? History shows the Olympics go 20% over budget. You take your budget, you add 20% on as a matter of course. It's called reference-based forecasting. Things like that, to combat overconfidence, it's a major, major task, because it leads to problems when you reach the real world.
Mm-hmm.
Just to pick up on that, I think another real enormous contribution of behavioral science is making us aware of some of these biases or heuristics that can get in the way as we, either look backward at past events or we look forward and try to project. Michael spoke about overconfidence bias. There's also things like hindsight bias, our tendency to look back at something and assume it was very easily predictable. Of course, it worked out that way. And confirmation bias, the tendency to essentially find what you're looking for, right? To reinforce the things that you were looking for as you look backwards. So I think if we're more aware of these tendencies that we have as humans, we can be more aware of them and potentially build into some of our processes and our thinking ways to mitigate them. And one thing that we do, we try to do as a matter of course, is the idea of pre-mortems, looking forward to try to anticipate what could go wrong, not only as a matter of thinking ahead and trying to plan ahead, but also I think over time to kind of show ourselves, that, we don't always predict outcomes properly. And, that reinforces the need, to be open to more ideas and not fall into the trap of assuming we know everything.
Mm-hmm.
I know, Michael, you've spoken a little bit about premortems, and the value of doing them in the manifesto and elsewhere. I didn't know if you wanted to speak more about that.
I mean, I'll leave Gary Klein to talk about premortems because he created them. So I think you've got him, haven't you?
Yes. Yeah. But I did want to ask you kind of on the borders of premortems and after action reviews, which we'll also be talking about this season. What is it about using different time periods, like looking forward and looking backwards as opposed to looking at today, that might be useful in gathering different perspectives and in being able to kind of suss out potential issues? Is there something in the mindset of imagining a different time?
This is where I think about scenario planning.
Mm-hmm.
And, the scenario planning as practiced by some companies like Shell has been around for quite a long time now. But my understanding is the point, scenarios are not predictions, right? They are ways of imagining the world. And people often think they're like predictions as in like, this is what's going to happen. But actually, as I understand it, one of the big benefits is that process of imagining a different world, of seeing how the same driver, say, I don't know, population growth or whatever, could lead to different outcomes. And that, I think, is the main benefit in terms of opening up ways of thought that can be quite path dependent. We just sort of say, oh, it's going to turn out this particular way. And that way of thinking can be exacerbated by looking at the past, because what you're seeing in the past is the way it turned out.
Mm-hmm.
Scott referred to this in hindsight bias. You're seeing one version and you don't see all the things that needed to have occurred, the chance events and so on, that led to this particular single outcome. And scenario planning kind of tries to open that up and pick apart the things that may have led there. And I think a final thing that I find quite helpful is you take that one step further and you think about how we're living in a complex system quite often, like a city, for example, where you have all these different parts interacting in ways that we don't fully understand. Quite often it kind of works. Mm-hmm. But what I think is incredibly interesting is to understand what are the kind of rules of the game that mean that it works, kind of the unspoken ways that people interact in a city like New York, for example, mm-hmm. that mean collectively we generate kind of outcomes like we don't crash into each other in Times Square. That, I think, is also about curiosity and understanding the kind of unseen rules that we are using all the time in these kind of systems. And I think if you can get there, that is actually, for me, a really key part of good policymaking as well. And you may have it in your organization as well. What are the things, the tacit things people are doing in your organization that make it work?
Mm-hmm. And these sort of really intentional conversations about what's happened in the past and what were the specific elements that not everybody saw, but that were there, as well as what could potentially happen in the future, kind of helps to crystallize.
Memory is biased quite often. There are many studies to do with jurors, for example, about what they remember and don't remember, witnesses in criminal trials. You can run experiments where people see a particular event and then, you can see what people remember. You can sort of change different aspects and you can see patterns in what people remember. So there are distortions of memory mm-hmm. that mean that we can have two people have very different understandings of the same event. And that's not particularly new insight, but I think if you don't bear that in mind, and you think about how you need to leave space for people to, how do I put this? If you're talking about the past, you need to leave space so people can match it to their memory as well, rather than just sort of saying this is how it was, right? Mm-hmm. You also need to sort of give people space to buy into your story, matching it to what they remember.
That's interesting. I wonder about also, a lot of what we think about is ethical decision making. And I wonder what the ethical implications of that are. Like if memory is more distorted or less distorted, depending upon how someone feels about their own behavior in a given situation.
Okay, so there are self-serving biases.
Mm-hmm.
One of the most powerful things from psychology is that we act to preserve a positive self-image, to feel good about ourselves. If we are aware that we did something and yet we also have an image of ourselves as someone who doesn't do that kind of thing, that's unpleasant. It can provoke what we call cognitive dissonance. And that's like actually feeling bad. And so the famous idea is that you try and reduce that bad feeling. And you either do that by acting differently and sort of changing your behavior to bring it in line with your self-image, or you change your kind of attitudes and your beliefs, and you think about that thing you did, and you represent it to yourself, and you say, well, actually, was it really conflicting with my values because of this, this, and this? This is a very powerful post-rationalization that we do to alleviate that unpleasant feeling we get.
So an after-action review or a post-mortem could be uncomfortable.
Oh, I think it definitely will be. So then the question is, how do you anticipate that? How do you give people an outlet for that? How do you prevent them from being backed into a corner and defend their self-image by rewriting history?
Mm-hmm.
You need to give an outlet in a constructive way forward rather than that defensive corner.
I just add it's a real challenge, right? Because again, people will rationalize away negative behaviors and still hold on to the perception of themselves as fundamentally good people. You know, if you're looking to prevent negative behaviors, you may want to try to link those things to self-image because it have a stronger impact on limiting people's tendency to do something.
Mm-hmm.
So it kind of an interesting dilemma of, on the one hand, how do we allow people to make mistakes and recover from them, so to speak, and be open about them,
right?
So they don't fall down a snowball's path, so to speak, of covering up and getting worse. But on the other hand, how do we link negative behavior to negative self-perception so that there's a stronger impact in hopefully reducing people's likelihood to commit even small behaviors that will reflect negatively on their self-image.
Part of the reason that I'm so curious about the forward-looking element of it, and you each spoke a little bit to this, is, you know, in the financial services sector, certainly we've seen over the course of the last decade and a half a couple of examples of a failure of imagination leading to some problems. You know, who could imagine that house prices would go down, right? And so the kind of experimentation, Michael, that you were talking about, you know, I think could potentially be helpful in imagining these kind of previously unseen scenarios.
One thing that comes to mind, which may be interesting for your listeners, is increasingly people use agent-based modeling, which is basically where you simulate different people interacting with different entities, and you work out what are the different futures where people, you know, the collective decisions go one way or another way. So you kind of build it so each kind of individual person is making decisions, and then you see how they all interact. And now the thing about agent-based modeling, that's very interesting and powerful, and you can change different aspects and say, well, what happened if the weather was slightly different? Does that affect how this collective behavior happens? And this is relevant for the economy, right? So you can simulate different economic outcomes, like house price changes.
Mm-hmm.
What I think is really interesting is a lot of these models have been based on rational choice theories of behavior, where people act in their best interest, they weigh up costs and benefits and make a decision accordingly. And what we're seeing on the kind of cutting edge of this is that you see models which are more behaviorally accurate based on some of the things that we look at in terms of mental shortcuts, the fact you copy people, you don't weigh up the costs and benefits, you look at what others are doing. And that's behavioral science infusing into agent-based modeling. And it can offer a really more accurate set of future thinking scenarios, really. So you're not just going on what do we think will happen in the future and try and create creativity. You're letting the model do the work just more accurately, we hope, based on what people actually do.
So I want to move to a little bit of a meta question, Michael, which is we're thinking a lot about using forward and backward thinking to improve decision making. And I'm curious about what you learned from your own experience in writing the manifesto, which was a bit of an exercise in forward and backward thinking, that might help this conversation.
Yep. So some quick thoughts. First of all, it's the hindsight bias thing that Scott mentioned. Like, it's very easy looking back to construct a narrative like this was all inevitable, that people would be interested in this kind of thing. We'd be sitting here 10 years later. But I remember at the time it wasn't like that at all, and we were very uncertain. It felt like a risk, and we didn't really know if it would pay off, and maybe people just wouldn't be interested. But it's very easy to construct that narrative afterwards. At the same time, I felt that it was only from looking back on things that I could see what had happened sometimes. So I think there were some choices that we made in our early days that influenced the way that the field developed in like a long-term way, focusing on testing, focusing on changing specific aspects of an organization or a service. So I think that was really helpful in terms of looking back. Looking forward, I was just struck again by the fact that I've spent like a lot of my career like writing stuff, like doing stuff, like we do a lot of practical projects, but when I write stuff, it's like, here's what we should do. Here are some recommendations. I've been doing this for a while now. And just particularly here, I felt, well, it's hard work knowing what to do. And I think, but we think we got there. That's solvable. Actually doing this stuff, making it a reality, living up to the ambitions here, it's just really hard because you publish some report and then you go back to your day job and all the same incentives are still there. All the same things that make it really hard for someone to be the first person to do things differently are still there. And that difference between what I know we should be doing and just the difficulty of making the first move was just really apparent to me. And it's really ironic because that's what we focus on.
Right. And
even knowing what I should do and knowing the barriers, I found it really hard to make some of these changes myself. And it's a humbling experience.
Because you're human.
Because you're human, because people will know when they're running organizations, you don't have complete freedom. Some people who may work for you think you could do everything, but you can't. And that's really hard. It's a really hard trade-off to make off. It's really hard to reconcile that in your mind, but it's true.
Mm-hmm. And doing it yourself is that difficult. Getting a whole organization to move in a particular direction is nigh impossible. So I'll ask the impossible, and Scott, I'll direct this to you. What advice would you give to leaders who are trying to fundamentally change the culture of their teams or organizations, or let's say the financial services sector?
I think maybe two main themes come to mind for me in thinking about that. I think first message might be that, as leaders, the common default or tendency is to think about changing culture from the top down, and if I put forth the right core ideas and I repeat them and I make them visible and and hopefully, of course, I embody them and model them myself, that everything will flow positively downward from there. But I'd encourage them to also keep in mind that we can change culture from the bottom up as well. And that, we can complement those top-down efforts by thinking very specifically about the behaviors that constitute an ethical culture and environment. And to focus on moving more people towards those behaviors, whether it's moving from 50% to 60 or 80 to 90, but getting more people to consistently do those specific actions that we're looking for. And I think what we find, and we mentioned, I think, rationalization earlier, that behavior can change attitudes and culture as well. And that when people are doing something, they tend to adjust their own thinking to align with their behaviors. So again, I think that's another path to changing in a culture internally. And then I'd say one maybe broader theme is just, I think a lot of energy inevitably goes towards policing behavior and, thinking and focusing on what I believe is mostly a minority of folks who have active negative intent, and preventing wrongdoers from succeeding. And of course, that's critical. But I think there's a larger opportunity around prevention. And that's, speaking to the vast majority of employees in most organizations, in most cultures, that want to do the right thing. And I think there we often fall into the trap of thinking we just need to persuade them more and give them more information, and that will make the difference. And sometimes that has the opposite effect of confusing and overwhelming people. And if we take more of a mindset of let's make it easier for people, let's help them do the right thing and make that the easier path, that's going to be more likely to move the culture and move the majority of folks to doing the things that ultimately constitute the culture and the environment that we want.
So we just have a few minutes left. I have a couple more questions. First, where do you see the most promising opportunities for applying behavioral science to the financial services world? Scott, I'll start with you on this one also.
Sure. Well, I tend to think of things in terms of what we call win-win-win opportunities, which are opportunities that have definite value to the organization, but are also positive for the people impacted, whether that's customers or employees, and ultimately benefit society. And tied to that, I think we look for areas where we have what we think of as intent to action gaps, where most people do indeed want to do the right thing, but they aren't necessarily doing it, whether habits are getting in the way or confusion or complexity. I think those are the areas that we can apply behavioral science both ethically and effectively. When I think of which areas, kind of fit that description for me, the ones that come to mind are compliance as an area where, again, we tend to sometimes overwhelm people with information and complexity. And I think there's an opportunity to simplify in many cases, to apply social norms and to get more people ultimately to the place they want to be, which is doing the right thing consistently.
Sorry, Scott, to interrupt you, but you said to apply social norms. What do you mean by that?
Well, that can be a couple of different things. But first off, in many cases, social norms can mean showing them that the majority of people are indeed complying and doing the right thing. Sometimes it's easy to rationalize that nobody else is doing it, anecdotally, because of one colleague who also isn't. But in reality, 80 or 90% of the people are doing the right thing.
Right.
Another dimension of social norms that I think of a lot in organizations is tapping into the power of teams or colleagues. So often the communication and the efforts are all aimed at the individual as an individual. But we all know that our behavior within an organization is usually influenced by the group of people we work with. And sometimes there's opportunities to leverage that, having people do something collectively, jointly, or even gentle forms of competition, our team versus others. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot of power there that we can tap into. And we've seen it, in fact, in work that we've done in organizations around things like employee health and wellness, as well as other areas. Another area in financial services that really comes to mind would be anti-fraud and cybersecurity related efforts. Those are ultimately human issues in most cases. It's a question of people following through on procedures. It's not just technology. And again, I think there's positive intent in those cases, and often it's helping people think before they act. And we've had success in integrating small interventions to help people become aware of things like phishing attempts, and to stop them, or at least mitigate the likelihood of sharing information that they shouldn't, and things of that nature. So I think there's a lot of potential tied to fraud and cybersecurity as well. And of course, there's this huge host of people issues, kind of the third bucket that comes to mind. Everything from employee engagement and retention, and health and wellness and safety, to issues around diversity and inclusion and gender equality and equity as well. And some of the things we've been talking about today in terms of process changes and so forth, I think can have enormous impacts, and indeed have been shown to have enormous impacts on success rates and behavior tied to those issues as well.
Mm-hmm. It strikes me that a lot of these things perhaps suffer from a similar issue when you talked about how allowing space to exercise curiosity can sometimes be seen as like time consuming, and this is the way things have always worked. And so this is a little bit of an annoyance that we have to kind of stop and listen to these things that could go wrong. It's never gone wrong before. Why is it going to go wrong this time? And compliance is often seen kind of with this same, like, let's just get through it so we can get to the stuff that matters. And so that kind of emphasis on these processes are actually important, and here are the ways in which they can lend themselves to the bottom line, I think is something that behavioral science can kind of offer people, that perspective. So I think we just have a couple of minutes left. I'd like to be able to ask more, but I'll wrap up with a final question, which is, what recommendations would you have for those listening who'd like to learn more about behavioral science generally?
Well, one website that I read myself, one kind of magazine is Behavioral Scientist. It's like really, I would say, high quality set of like articles, not just like about behavioral science, oh, this is interesting, but also like relating it to current events and offering new perspectives on things. So I would recommend people look at that.
Scott?
I'd agree that behavioral scientists would probably be the first place I would start. One other one that comes to mind is Habit Weekly.
Did you say Habit Weekly?
Yes, it's a site and a newsletter called Habit Weekly, and probably a little bit more of a practitioner or applied angle to it, but also does a good job, I think, of summarizing a lot of what's going on in the field, from research to case studies and so forth. So that's another place that I would look to if I was looking to one or two resources to kind of keep me informed and show me a range of things going on in this world, and maybe point me towards areas to dive deeper.
Thank you both very much for being with us today. Appreciate it.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
For more conversations like this, as well as publications and other resources related to banking culture reform, please visit our website at newyorkfed.org/governance and culture reform.